So, RJ, I love your book so much.
Oh.
So much. And I hope you saw my cream review.
Yes. That was
okay, good.
super nice. And
I was just flipping as I was reading it. I was just like, this is just the coolest biography I've ever read. And it was, the subject, it was so overdue, and you were the perfect guy to do it. And I can't believe how much you squeezed in such a short amount of space. I mean, it's really one of those wonderfully dense books that reads like the wind,
Well, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
I got way into the, I think just, I was working on it for a few years, and then the pandemic, the lockdown hits, and I just, I had no excuses. I was able to keep working and stare at the screen and just crank on.
Right. Well, it just reads beautifully, and I think like a lot of people, I came to it with, just great, massive oceans of affection for the man and the music, and I really got my myth cut down to size. It's such a, I mean, in so many ways, it's such a sad book. The lack of self-awareness, the predatory nature, really, just like the persona he built is just so seductive, and the life behind it is so complicated. Oh my God.
Yeah. Complicated is a good word.
Well, complicated, right. And so tell me about the process of unpeeling all of those layers and getting to touch. I assume you start with the great love and affection that all critics do for that guy.
Yeah. Lots of love and affection for him, for sure. And, just constant awareness of how he changed things in my life, in my friends, in the culture, in the world. And so that's what got me going, and that's what got a foot in the door. And I also knew in the abstract and just around the edges, that there were other sides to the man that I didn't know so well. And I thought, well, that could be really good for a writer. It'll keep me interested, and I want to try to put it together in some way, both sides or all different sides. And can it be done? Does this add up to one person or multiple people at the end of the day? It was never boring. And he's just huge. He's a huge, bottomless entity.
Right. So tell me some of the challenging parts about doing that. Like you learn, you get a new piece of information, or you have an interview with a source, and you realize, oh, now I have to make sense of this. Talk to me about some of those challenges.
Yeah. Well, one big thing is, I want to interest people in music that I find interesting, or music that I love. I want people to love music that I love. And so when I'm finding out other things about this person, when I'm finding out his relationship with women, or with people in the band, or with fans sometimes, all those things on many occasions could be really positive things. They could also on many occasions be terrible things for those people involved. And so when I hear about that stuff, I want to put it in a context that sheds a lot of light on who he was, but I'm not looking to tell people you should not listen to this music. There is not anything to get from it, because there is a world to be gotten from this music. Yeah. So wrestling with that is one big aspect. What's the right amount of balance so that I'm not avoiding a subject, but I'm not turning people off from the rest of the book for the rest of Chuck Berry. So that was just always there in my head. And getting people to talk was in a different way. That was a big problem. Getting people to feel comfortable talking about experiences they had, and many experiences were great, energetic experiences, positive. But getting people to talk about bad things that happened to them, bad things that Chuck said to them for no good reason, and then trying to understand why. That's a huge part of it too. Like somebody does somebody acts a certain way in your life, somebody you know acts a certain way, you can walk away from it, or you can say, well, this person is a part of me, and how do I make sense of it?
Right.
That was a huge part of the work for me.
Right. Right. And he obviously, because his method was he would go to different towns, and he'd just hire pickup bands in every different town, then why would he choose to be so rude and spiteful on stage if he didn't like the bass player?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I mean, to me, that's just kind of random. Now, the one theory that I liked that you floated in there was that he really did kind of see his fame as a way of getting some kind of cosmic revenge on, the systematic racism that he kept confronting. And that helps make sense of it. And yet, there's 16-year-old kids on the bass who's like living the dream playing with Chuck Berry and, like getting humiliated.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it was like in a conscious way of him saying, okay, this is my chance to necessarily to pay back for what was done to me. But sometimes it was. But most of the time, I think he just, in that way that, many people, it's kind of human nature to, upon occasion, when injustice has been done to one, all the stuff that we carry forward in our lives, that's one thing that gets carried forward too, unfortunately, is sometimes the crap that happens to you or me, it haunts us, and and that's where it goes to the next unfortunate person. And so that's a part of it for Chuck too. But you're right. I mean, he had a way of, he'd go to town, and the bands would be fans, oh my, Mr. Barry, do you want to practice? What songs are we going to play? What keys are we going to play them in? Don't worry about it. Just watch me and fall in. And so mistakes were made, and Chuck wouldn't be happy about them. And there was music, and sometimes great shows, sometimes terrible shows. And there was this theater all the time, this kind of other kind of performance of Chuck versus the band. It's very, it strikes me as Dylan-esque that way. Like, he didn't want to rehearse. He really wanted that whatever got on tape or on the stage to be just like the musicians finding their way into the song as the song goes forward. Right? That's definitely.
So who was your big white whale who you desperately wanted in the book but couldn't nail down?
Wow.
Did you have anyone like that?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, on some level, I always wanted, and from the start, I had reached out to the family. I was hoping for their involvement and their stories and their memories, and their understanding of who he was. I wanted them to also selfishly, be a good fact check for me. So this is what somebody told me. What do you think? You were there. You would be able to tell me if this address was right or if this date was right or whatever. So, and they were always super polite and very, very pleasant to talk to. And I talked to the son, Charles Berry Jr. A bunch of times, and it was always in the context of, well, we'll do an interview. Now's not a good time. Let's do it in a couple months, and a couple months just never came. So I'm disappointed about that, but I understand in my mind why that was not of interest to the family, perhaps. But I certainly wish I'd gotten them. I'd have to think beyond that. There's definitely, if I could have talked, he had been long gone by the time I was working on this book. But Johnny Johnson, Chuck's the band leader of the band that Chuck joined at the beginning of his career, a piano player who really had a huge role in a lot of the making of those early records and early songs. Somebody who saw Chuck up close with a very watchful eye and very kind of quiet, keep it all inside guy.
Right.
Johnny Johnson, if I could have sat down and talked to him over a course of an evening or two, that would have been, just a bolt of lightning.
Yeah,
he
well,
died years before.
Right, but you did access all of this fabulous legal testimony.
Yeah.
When Johnson tries to get songwriting credit. Tell us how you got a hold of that, and that section is so. He actually sounds like he made a couple hardcore lawyers melt.
Yeah. So there's a man, a professor and a lawyer and a good writer named Timothy McFarlane, and he had written several essays about copyright law and songwriter ownership, and he clearly had an ear for music. Has an ear for music, and he early on, Chuck joins Johnny's band in '54, early '50s, and then is on the band that had a lot of those early hits with Chuck. He didn't play on Johnny Be Good almost certainly, but he played on Maybelline, many of those early hits, and Johnny was involved in sitting around in practice sessions and on the stage live, working out songs that later became Chuck Berry hits. So late in his life, Johnny Johnson got a bug in his ear. People were kind of encouraging him that he never got his due, which definitely is true. He was a quiet, intense sideman in the classic celebratory sense. He didn't want to leave a band. He didn't want to be Chuck Berry. He wanted to be Johnny Johnson, the guy playing for Chuck Berry. And so, but he didn't get the attention and the love and all the money that he deserved for sure. And so people suggested, hey, you should sue that guy. You should sue that guy. That's your music too. And he did. And it was too late in the day legally to mount a good legal effort. But they gave recorded testimony, depositions, Chuck and Johnny sitting in a lawyer's office with instruments in the office. So they weren't even yelling at each other at all or fighting, even though Johnny was suing Chuck for a lot of money. And if there was one thing in life Chuck did not want to do, it was to give up his money. It just sounds like this magical, series of hours where in front of lawyers they're explaining how songs came into existence that were amazing songs, and they would get a guitar out and a keyboard out and start describing who did what, and they didn't agree on a lot of that, but at the end of the day so McFarlane got access to as he was writing papers and journal papers about songwriting and the legal side of who gets royalties and who gets compositional credit. He got access to the depositions that were recorded and not public record, and he quoted at length from them in some pieces that he's written that you can find on the internet. And I talked to him many times. He was super helpful, and from this you get a sense of Johnny talking about his contribution and Chuck talking about what Johnny brought and what he brought. And you get a great sense of how these amazing songs were written in a way that you don't usually hear about. Any kind of classic American songwriting. It's a real window into that.
And who knew that it would be a good thing to tape these depositions? What an amazing idea. I mean, and you had access to these tapes?
I had access to McFarlane. He has the tapes, and he has not shared them except a quote from them, which he has he was given the green light from the lawyers involved, Johnny's lawyer, Chuck's lawyers, to quote at length from those recordings. So he shared some of that with me. Okay.
Wow. That sounds like Holy Grail stuff,
It really does.
That sounds like Elvis autopsy level. Like, when do we get to see that?
It is. It's like being there at the at the quartet, right? The
Right.
Sun Records with Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis sitting around at the piano singing these songs and just doing it because they love to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but you have a wonderful quote. I think it's from Chuck Berry's lawyer, who says that the process really endeared him to Johnny Johnson, even though Johnson was the guy suing him, and it was really clear that he had a good case, but that there was no legal remedy. And how affectionate he felt towards Johnson by the end of the whole thing. I mean, I just think that's astounding. You never see a quote like that from a lawyer.
Yeah. Johnny would say when they were recording, when they would stop giving deposition, there was a break. He'd ask how the other lawyers are doing, and he'd say, "Hey, I got a show coming up next week. Would you like some free tickets? I can get you in to hear me play." And he was just by all accounts, no one has, he was a big drinker, and that's the only thing people can say about Johnny was that he could be a mess when he was drinking, but everybody loved Johnny Johnson. And if you heard him play, that's a big part of why everybody loved Johnny Johnson, because he was so much of him came through in there. Yeah. And so he was the guy on the stage in the background, taking it all in, and amazing boogie woogie style piano player.
So that brings me to another question about how if Johnson is the band leader and Chuck Berry joins the band, and Johnson realizes that Chuck Berry is much more of a front person, there's a remark that Keith Richards makes in the Hail Hail Rock and Roll movie about how all these Chuck Berry songs are in these strange guitar keys. And I don't know if you learned anything more about this, but I've heard other guitarists make this remark that sometimes these songs are in the key of B flat or E flat, and that those are really good piano keys, but like reasonable piano keys, but not very good guitar keys. Did you hear any of that as you did your work? And to me, it makes sense. Right. It makes sense on the level that if Johnny Johnson is the band leader does call the keys, right? Yeah. Yeah. But it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that Chuck Berry would write Johnny Be Good in B flat. That just everyone plays that in A. I mean, there's just the open strings, the shape of those licks. Yeah. But I'm very curious about. It's a little technical, but I'm really curious because Keith Richards does make that comment, and of course, when you're Keith Richards, you're busy sounding it out on your record player at home with a guitar, and it doesn't make sense, some of the keys these things are in. Did anyone else remark on that?
I have heard that definitely over the years of working on this project, for sure. Different people have said different things. There are definitely guitarists who feel the opposite, that isn't the important thing. But for sure, Keith Richards feels that way, and many other musicians also. They talk about the keys, and I'm not a musician, so my ability to communicate this is hits a wall at some point. But that the keys are jazz, are from the jazz, are more jazz than blues. That they come from piano music more than guitar music, and one thing that I definitely think is true. And so that might be a Johnny thing, like Johnny's origins of some of the melodies or some of the songs passing on to Chuck and everybody in the band. But another way of thinking about it, I think, is that one thing that Chuck definitely did. So there's this music, boogie woogie piano music, predates, from it probably goes even further back, but in the 20s and 30s. It's huge. It's a dance. It's a blues dance style that had that was created on the piano. Powerful left hand bass keeping the rhythm going, and variations going on. That's the left hand. The right hand variations going on there, and they're playing off against each other at different times. Sometimes,
Right.
And so one thing that definitely seems to have happened all in music in general, in the move from blues to rhythm and blues, guitars are playing that. Guitar players are picking that up. Chuck Berry, when he went to reform school as a teenager and joined a band in the reform school that he was interred in for several years, he's learning how to play this music from a piano player in reform school. So boogie woogie music is moving from the piano to the guitar, and that's an important part of how rock and roll it sounds like it did then and does today even. So those rhythms and those melodies and those keys are changing from piano to guitar, and that's a huge part of the history of the sound too. So whether it's all from Johnny or from people even Chuck was listening to before he met Johnny, I think there's something there about about piano music transferring over. Yeah,
interesting. And the boogie woogie there's different stripes of boogie woogie too, and I'm wondering if you. I don't know. Is stride a synonym for it, or is it a stripe of boogie woogie, and would you have called, or did you hear Johnny Johnson call himself a stride player?
Wow, I think stride is related. I don't want to get too deep because I'd have to think about it and really.
Yeah, I don't know either. I'm just curious how.
But Johnny would call himself a boogie woogie player more than a
boogie woogie player. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's the way he would call himself, a blues guy. He could play jazz, but he would call himself a blues and a boogie woogie piano player most of all.
And he did make a record after Hail Hail Rock and Roll, right?
Johnny made a number of records, and he played. He had a good late in life, in the 80s and 90s. He played with he played with Keith Richards on occasion and Eric Clapton. He toured with Eric Clapton. And there's a country band that was really big for a few years that loved playing with Johnny, and he was on several of their records. The name will come to me in a second. So yeah, he had a good late in life second or third act.
One of the passages I love is that you're detailing Barry's run-in with the law, run-ins, and you sort of set up how he keeps getting caught, and that it's clear that he's sort of like they have him targeted, and that his next infraction is going to be serious no matter what it is. And then he gets sent away, and then we figure out which songs he writes in prison. Can you tell us how you figured that stuff out and how that led to some really interesting insights to his character and such?
Yeah, so he we talked about Chuck as a teenager going to reform school, as he called it, for an armed robbery conviction, and then he gets out. He goes back home to St. Louis. He starts a musical career in about the second half of the 50s. He's a huge, almost global star, huge pop star in America, of course, and he's at the peak of his fame. And he gets arrested for violation of the Mann Act, which is it's a complicated law, but basically he was crossing state lines with a woman and having sex with her in different states, and so it was a federal law, a felony, and he goes to prison for several years in the early 60s for violating the Mann Act. While he's there, he wrote. So his career came to a grinding halt at that point. At the peak of his fame, he disappears. He'd recorded a bunch of stuff, knowing that he was going to prison soon. But it wasn't great stuff, and Chess didn't kind of sat on some of it. And so while he's there, he's not recording, but he's writing songs. And and when he came out of prison in 63, 64. He had a raft of songs ready to be recorded, songs like The Promised Land and Never Can Tell, and several others that are as good as anything he ever wrote. And so for about a year and a half, 2 years after he comes out of prison, he had about 4 songs on the charts that were really, really important, great hits. They kept him a vibrant performer. But, you know, I think like when he was in prison then, he worked in it was a federal prison and a federal hospital for prisoners that would get sent there if they needed special medical attention. So it was a little different setup in Missouri. And he worked as not an orderly, but like an assistant in the hospital. And I just imagine him turning the radio on as he's working, 1963, and he's hearing the Beach Boys, or he's hearing the Beatles. He's hearing them do Chuck Berry music, play Chuck Berry riffs, cover Chuck Berry songs. In the Beach Boys' case, Surfing USA, a literal rewrite of a Chuck Berry song.
Right.
And what that must have been like to hear that in prison. It would be like a scene in a movie, you know, like, hey, that sounds familiar. And so he comes out and he's got to have all these complicated feelings of, he knows his moment may have passed. He knows he's got these songs that are different from what he'd written before. They're kind of deeper and they're talking about social issues in a masked way. And he wants to jump in and hit the ground running. And it kind of happened and it kind of didn't. Right.
But he gets booked on the Tammy Show. That's a very important appearance for him, right?
Can you imagine the Tammy Show, which was 64, I believe? And,
there's actually 2. So 64 and 65. And I would have to go check, but I know he's 64. He might also be 65, but that's an interesting bill, right? Because it makes this overlap that you're talking about.
Yeah. So it was this concert, this all-star kind of video recorded concert that became like a. It was recorded and then presented as a movie in movie theaters across the country. The TAMI stood for something, but the Rolling Stones were on this bill, and Chuck was on the bill, and Marvin Gaye, Leslie Gore. It was an incredible lineup. And there's a moment where a British Invasion Act is playing a Chuck song. Well, Chuck's playing a Chuck song. He starts out playing it on the stage. And then he hands it off literally to
it's Jerry and the
Pacemakers. And it is a crazy, you know, Jerry and the Pacemakers, lovely, fun-loving, charming group of guys, and I like their music, but it is a surreal experience to see Chuck Berry hand off one of his songs to these guys who were kind of hitching up their pants to play it.
Right.
And Chuck's got to smile and pass on the baton. There's a lot going on there.
Right. Now there must have been some buried tracks that you rediscovered or that you may have heard for the first time, or some unreleased stuff that you heard. Can you talk about some of the new Chuck Berry material that you came across as you did your research?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of B-sides, and you know, when he came out of prison, he made a live recording with for one thing that there's a good feel in this recording. And it's also a kind of a what might have been, is when he got out, he did a live recording right away in 64 with the Motown house band. You know, they played just outside of Detroit for a couple nights, recorded it, and they did not rehearse together. Chuck was just out of prison and he hadn't rehearsed a lot. His voice he had a cold. But the recordings are out there, and sometimes there's definitely stuff on there that has a whole different feel, has more of a bar band R&B feel. There's a lot of sax on it, and it's all, you know, it's blues and Chuck Berry's hits, and that is kind of a fascinating recording, definitely worth hearing. I think a song that doesn't get a lot of attention that I go back to a lot, and that Chuck recorded a number of times and wasn't done with. There's a version of it on his last album, Chuck, that is Havana Moon, and it's almost a reggae or really a ska kind of tune that he wrote in the late 50s. It doesn't sound like rock and roll. It's slower, and the beat is different than it usually is on Chuck records. There's not a lot of piano on it. It's a haunting kind of odd song out in the Chuck catalog that he loved. And Havana Moon is definitely worth seeking out. I'm
so glad you brought up that song. That for my money, that is the great lost Chuck Berry song, and it hints at a huge range of stuff that the might have been stuff. It always sounded to me like that he made that alone. Is there other instruments on that?
That's a good question. I want to say there's a bass on there, but it is a lonely, echoey recording that doesn't have much. I think there's a drum and there's bass, and but
I'll have to go listen to it again.
Yeah, it's this middle of the night dance song.
Right. Yeah. Well, right. It's I mean, it's a song where you can just actually see the picture. I mean, you can just see the moonlight on the water. It's an extraordinary piece of work. And then you brought up this last record. So tell us the story of the ending and him recording at this local club and making this record. I was astonished when this record came out because I thought, can I bear to put this on? And then I was like, this is the friskiest record I've ever heard. It's just like, whoa. But the backstory is very complicated, and his decline is complicated. Tell us about that.
In the last couple decades of his life, he died in 2017. He was playing a lot in a mid-sized, not large room in a great club in St. Louis called Blueberry Hill. Joe Edwards, the owner of Blueberry Hill, had a long friendship and somewhat of a business relationship with Chuck, and they just had a really good communication, which wasn't always the case with Chuck. And Chuck trusted Joe Edwards. So, one day they were hanging out at Blueberry Hill, as the story goes, and Chuck was talking about how he used to just play the clubs in East St. Louis, small clubs, crowd, shoulder to shoulder in front of the stage, and how much he missed that experience. Yeah. And Joe said, well, you know what? I think I know how you could remedy that gap in your life, Chuck. And so what they instituted was Chuck in the last years of his life. He stopped playing, in the very last years of his life. But from I'd have to look up the dates, but around the turn of from the 90s into the years after the aughts, and into the early teens maybe, Chuck was playing once a month at Blueberry Hill in a room called the Duck Room, which was lined with duck lures, hunting lures, something that Joe Edwards collected. The Duck Room, you could also say it was for the Duck Walk, but I think it was the duck lures. And so he played with a band that he knew. His son was in it. His daughter played in that band. A great singer and harmonica player. Guys that he knew and played with a lot in St. Louis were all there. So for somebody who played with a lot of pickup bands, he had musicians he liked and trusted and knew what he was doing. And he was playing for a hometown crowd. Right. And over the years, as word got out, hey, Chuck Berry plays at Blueberry Hill once a month. Tickets, they for a long time there weren't advance tickets available. You had to stand in line at the box office an hour before the show started. But eventually people were hearing and flying from New York, from the West Coast. They were flying from Europe and Japan to go see Chuck Berry at Blueberry Hill once a month. And yeah, those shows just sound like they were, you know, it was, Chuck was forgetting things, and
Right.
Chuck Berry songs have a natural ability to flow from one into the other seamlessly, and there was a lot of that going on. But he was with musicians that knew what to do when that happened. Chuck always had a sense of humor about it, and you know, I just think those shows sound like they are really magical.
Yeah. And so who produces the record, and how many tapes do they have? Did they tape a lot of shows? Did they just do two or three?
So he put out a studio album that he'd been working on for years, and recording and re-recording and re-recording. That came out just after he died. But more recently, just last year, yes, a live recording of one of those amazing Blueberry Hill shows.
Oh, that's what I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
It's the live show. You're right.
That came out last year, and yeah, it really is a fun, high energy, really good recording. A good night. He plays a couple of numbers you don't associate with Chuck Berry. So that, who knew that somebody was sitting on that? But somebody decided to get up and release it to the world, and I'm really glad they did, because it's a great snapshot of Chuck Berry at the peak of his powers, late in his life, playing to a hometown crowd that loves him, and he's feeding off that energy, and the band is feeding off it, and it's a good time.
Okay, so to finish off, I want to hear your opinion. I can't remember whether you get explicit about this or not, but there's long been a theory that the secret subject of Johnny B. Good is Elvis Presley, and that Chuck Berry is writing the life story of Elvis Presley. I don't know if you ever got a quote on that, or what your feeling is, whether that was somehow true on an explicit level or an implicit level.
It's a funny thing. I think there's no single answer to that. I really don't.
Right.
Because what he does in that song, on the one hand, it feels very personal. You know, here's a story about of course, in the lyric, it's a country boy named Johnny B. Good. But when he first wrote the song, before it was recorded, the lyric was a colored boy named Johnny B. Good. And whether it was somebody around Chuck, or maybe it was Leonard Chess in the studio saying, you know, you've got a great song here, and we are going to only reach a fraction of the audience if you use the word colored boy in your song, Chuck. Think about that. The lyric changes. So, you know, he comes from the deep South down to New Orleans, the country, and he takes over. So on that way, it feels like a Chuck Berry talking about, not that he was from New Orleans, but that it was something of his own experience. But at the same time, he's narrating it. He's a storyteller looking at this outside character. He says, "Go, Johnny, go!" Right. And so he's talking about somebody who's not himself when he's performing it. So it's all of the above. It's the amazing thing. He's cheering on somebody who he's seeing from a distance. He's also celebrating his own story to some degree, in secret. He worked on a lot of levels. Yes, I love that answer. Great answer. RJ, those are my questions. It's been so much fun yapping to you again. Tim, my friend, it's great to hear your voice. Oh, what's next on your list? What are you working on now? Wow, good question. You know, reading for pleasure. I've been doing some of that and finding out I really like it again. I want to get going on a new project. I've got a couple of ideas. Nothing for sure. Who do you want to see written about? What's the book you want to see? Well, you know, gosh, how do you follow James Brown and Chuck Berry? I mean, got to go in a different direction, right? I can't. Right. I have been wanting to sell a biography of Tina Turner, and I can't get that. I mean, because she has two memoirs, people are like, no, that's saturated that space. But I have long felt that she deserves a major, major world-class treatment.
And you would be the guy to do that. I mean, she's just too important. Let me think about that. What else?
I know. I'm thinking.
You know, in Britain, they're very big on Eddie Cochran. And I think he's pretty major too. But, I don't know. Let me think on that. But I know it'll be great whatever you do.
All right.
All right.
Well, Jim, more to come. Talk to you soon.
Take care. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.